So the meeting is being recorded. Welcome everyone. We're at the top of the hour. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. We're very pleased to have Chester here, who is going to speak to us about what the best execution looks like. Chester has asked that you hold your questions until he pauses at about 15 minutes and about 30 minutes. And he's also very happy to stay after for questions for as long as it takes. There are also at least two of Chester's co-authors are here, Tom and Jian, and they will be helping answering questions in the chat. So if anything is burning, please put it in the chat. And also Tom and Jian, if you see that something absolutely has to be addressed on the floor, I'll please interrupt. So Chester, the floor is all yours. Thank you very much again, and thank you all for coming.
Well, thanks very much for everybody being here. So what I'm going to talk about today, first let me acknowledge let me begin by acknowledging my co-authors, Tom Ernst, Andrey, Malenko, and Jian Sun.
And I see Andrey is here too, so
okay,
all the co-authors are here.
Terrific. I'm sure they can help with many. I'm sure they can help with many of the questions. Our focus in this paper is what's the nature of best execution, and underlying this, the underlying problem is the broker. And in particular, what's the nature of best execution in retail trading? Brokers obviously they receive orders. They either route them to exchanges, or they route them to wholesalers. One of the criticisms in recent years of brokers is that they often route to wholesalers rather than to exchanges. Not only often route, mostly that's what they route. And more than 90% of retail executions are done through wholesalers. The exchanges are quoting, such as the Nasdaq and the NYSE, and wholesalers such as Citadel and Virtu are also involved in quoting and do a lot of off-exchange executions, particularly for retail. Retail trade, I think as most of us understand, retail trade is relatively more desirable than anonymous order flow because it doesn't have it tends to have less adverse selection and has relatively little correlation, at least compared to institutional orders. The wholesales also invest a lot in technology. They invest a lot in routing, and they often offer better pricing in a couple of ways than the exchanges for the retail orders, because the retail orders are relatively attractive. They offer a price payment for order flow in some, and at least some brokers accept payment for order flow, and they offer price improvement. Payment for order flow is a payment from a market center to a broker. I should say one thing about payment for order flow that is probably not as widely understood as it should be, even to some extent in our microstructure community. The brokers basically set, for a particular type of order, the brokers set a uniform payment for order flow rate across all wholesalers. So that actually has the effect of leveling the playing field. So a particular broker, let's say Schwab, they set the same price across all the different wholesalers. And so in that sense, if they're routing off exchange, they don't have a differential incentive in that routing based on the payment for order flow. I think that's a very helpful design, because it means that they quite naturally would focus upon the extent of price improvement that's being offered on behalf of their customers, and in that way, I think at least help ensure compliance with the best execution requirements in the current FINRA regulatory rule. The retail tends to get, as I noted earlier, retail tends to get better prices than the quoted spreads, in part because of this, because of the reduced adverse selection. And one of the issue we want to really explore in this paper is how did the brokers route among the wholesalers? I think it was previously recognized that basically the retail orders are basically going to the wholesalers, and I should note, by the way, that's true. When I say the retail orders are basically going to the wholesalers, other studies have pointed out that that's true even among those brokers who are not accepting payment for order flow. So brokers such as Fidelity and Vanguard, even though they're not accepting payment for order flow, they're still routing. Excuse me. They're still routing to the wholesalers. The wholesalers, and what our study is going to focus on, is how do the wholesalers compete. And so we're going to try to provide a framework to understand what a competitive allocation would look like, and why, to some extent, the brokers themselves might have different focuses in routing. In our paper, not in the current version of the paper, but in the revision that we're developing, we're going to include a theoretical model of the routing process in which there's a broker and wholesalers. The wholesalers are risk neutral. At the broker, each wholesaler obtains one order and needs to execute it at a certain cost. And then there's a maximum spread, and then the broker commits to an allocation rule, which represents the order fraction that the wholesalers receives at time one. And the broker's goal is to minimize the total expected cost charged by all wholesalers. That's sort of broadly the framework that we have in mind. Now, I think in part because we're still in the process of putting together, writing up the theoretical portion of our analysis. I'm gonna focus today more on the empirical portion, but I'll sort of just weave in some references as well to the theory. So, what are the kind of questions that I want to try to get at today? How do brokers allocate order flow now? Do the wholesalers get rewarded with more order flow for better improvement? Do the wholesalers behave in a competitive fashion? So impartially, how do the brokers route, and how do the wholesalers respond? And do they respond to try to do the wholesalers get rewarded if they provide more price improvement? That is, and are the wholesalers trying to get more share? What can we say about that? How should a broker allocate to get the best prices for his customers? That is, to what extent does what does the routing really depend on? How does it depend upon past history? What history? How far back do they go, for example? How do they route across securities? So here we're focused on equity, but do the brokers take into account the routing decisions on all the equity, or do they focus on a particular symbol, or perhaps somewhere in between? That is, securities with similar characteristics. How do they adjust based upon history? How do they balance the rewards while motivating the wholesalers to continue to improve? You could imagine, for example, that the brokers would allocate all of the orders to the wholesaler who provided the best execution in the past. But one problematic aspect of that is it would not motivate the wholesaler at all to continue to improve. In fact, quite to the contrary, it would give the wholesaler monopoly power. So this is sort of part of what we want to consider, and in particular, our empirical analysis will point out that there are sort of limits to how much get allocated to particular wholesalers. So our broad framework in the background is there'll be a mechanism design problem where there's routing dependent on history. But what history? What's the time? So we actually have data from three brokers. Three brokers very graciously provided us data on how they route to wholesalers. They provided us detailed data. The data is not in the same exactly the same style or format across the three brokers, but so we analyze the brokers separately. The Some brokers look back 30 days, some look back 90 days. Then among the questions are, how do they handle order size? That is, do they consider small order performance when routing a large order, or vice versa? When you route in Apple, do you also consider the performance in Microsoft? Um, um, how do you adjust based upon history? That is the routing all of the flow to one firm? Um, 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 Clearly, that's suboptimal. How do you balance the rewards with motivating the wholesalers to try to improve? Now, I think what we find is that routing is competitive. Wholesalers respond to the broker priorities as they see it. There's substantial variation in how brokers obtain the competition. Um, but weaker wholesalers. So, it seems from the data that some wholesalers have more limited market share than others, but those weaker wholesalers are still important to keeping the strong wholesalers competing. And the brokers may choose different priorities based upon the nature of their order flow. One way I think about that, maybe most simply, is that the brokers perhaps have somewhat different businesses, or at least perceive their businesses differently, and so they route based upon priorities that they set. Now, this is not the first paper to consider these types of questions, though I think the nature of the data that we use is different. Namely, it's data from the brokers as to how they route to the wholesalers, and also we're able to kind of link that to some degree to the policies of the brokers. But two other studies that have looked at these issues of competition. Um, the first is the Dahlberg, Schulko, and Warner study, which uses the 605 data to explore competition. And secondly, the Wang, Jian, Li, and Schwartz paper. Their paper suggests that brokers do poorly, but their focus in particular is on orders that they generated, and they were all small. They were all basically very small orders. I believe either one share orders or orders for fixed amounts, such as $100. So what are our contributions in this context? We have proprietary data from the brokers. This allows an extensive look at the routing. We're able to show that the broker focus matters to understanding broker decisions. We show that wholesalers seem to respond relatively strongly to the broker focus, and actually adjust their behavior when they perceive a change in broker focus. Um, um, I think we feel that our results are mostly consistent with a simple a mechanism design in which the broker designs the allocation to promote competition. And we're now working toward developing a more fully fledged dynamic mechanism design model to say more about the normative issues. Okay, so that's sort of the broad framework. So let me turn. So now we'll start to look at some of these issues with broker focus and the routing and performance relationship, and the connection between the market conditions and how the wholesalers perform. I think it's maybe a good place to start is to describe a bit about the policies of our three brokers. So first, I should note that the data that these are significant brokers. Collectively, they have a market share of more than 50% of equity brokerage. Secondly, I should note that they follow somewhat different policies. Broker A uses 30 days of history. Brokers B and C use 90 days of history. Broker A does so in the most disaggregated way. They route each symbol separately and then use 5 size categories. Broker C does it in the most aggregate way. They use one bin. So the question is sort of the bundle. Basically, the issue is about the bundling that they use, and we see different brokers. So all 3 of our brokers are using history. They're using different length histories, and they're using different levels of aggregation. And perhaps maybe this is a good point for me to pause for questions. This is sort of the 15-minute. This is at the 15-minute mark.
Yeah, I have a quick question. So the brokerage industry has itself changed through mergers and then adoption of zero commissions, and so is this like going to affect dynamically how they also change their routing policies in a more significant way?
Well, what changes in the industry affect how they change their routing policies? Yes. We have one situation in our sample, in fact, where there was entry of another. Well, okay, so we have data from 3 brokers. Obviously, there were changes in the nature in our sample period. There were changes somewhat in the nature of the industry has evolved. Although it is for recent years where I think maybe there's not been quite as much evolution. But there was one important change with respect to the wholesalers. There was entry of a wholesaler, and in one case, our sample allows us to explore what was the impact of the entry of the wholesaler, and I think that's at least partially responsive to this question.
Thanks.
And I'll get to the details of that later.
Chester, quick question. Were you able to ask these brokerages why they choose to do things the way they do them? So broker A makes decisions on a stock by stock level. That is interesting because that kind of opens up a question as how well they do in small stocks. Any information that you're allowed to share with us on that?
Well, okay. So some of our results will distinguish the small. We'll have some results toward the end of the paper that distinguish the small stocks from the large stocks. Why do they do things differently? I guess my takeaway from the discussions with the broker, I mean, the brokers tried to be pretty open with us, but it's a little, I found that, it's a little hard to, I think they all felt like this was the best way to ensure the incentives. So I'm not sure that there's necessarily more to take away from that. I also thought it was very natural that they wouldn't do things exactly I personally thought that I thought it was natural that they wouldn't necessarily do things exactly the same, because obviously every firm has its own approach and its own business model. What I was struck by was more the opposite, which was that there was a fair amount of similarity in how they proceeded. That they were all focused, for example, on history, about relatively recent. They were all focused on history and relatively recent history, and they also, in effect, also took this approach of spinning the wheel and basically deciding, okay, we're going to use a certain. They all took the approach of we're going to look at what percentage we're going to allocate percentages of orders within particular buckets, and rather than say, okay, now I have an order under certain, the focus seemed to be on basically on sort of using some sort of random allocation with conditional probabilities, conditional upon the circumstances. I don't know if Tom, would you have anything that you want to add to that, or?
Yeah, so of course they all feel that they're doing whatever they're doing optimally. They're also a little bit hesitant sometimes to share the exact thing they're doing because they want to make sure they all stress that they follow the holistic rubric that, FINRA requires them to look holistically at everything. They all say we holistically look at everything. The one thing I can say where we possibly can gain some insight is in the modeling part, we're coming up with an idea that depending on the sort of flow you have, if your retail flow is, let's say, more correlated or more costly for a wholesaler to execute, that might shape whether you want to bundle or not bundle. And then the other thing is if your investors are trading more of these high cost stocks, right? Like if they're trading really liquid stocks versus illiquid stocks, that also might influence whether you want to bundle or not, depending on the distribution of the stocks they trade, their clients trade.
Thanks. I'll go back to my, should I go back to my presentation?
Yes, we don't see any questions.
Okay,
further,
good.
so I
That's what I
guess-
wasn't sure.
Thank you.
That's
Yeah.
what I wasn't sure about. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, so I provided kind of a both a broad motivation and outline of the broad approach of how the brokers allocate. The key concept, maybe the key concept that underlies the sort of our focus is the nature of what's called EFQ, effective overquoted spread. The effective spread is how much the wholesalers or market makers they charge on orders. The quoted spread is basically the NBBO benchmark when the order arrives. Effective over quota is just a ratio of those. An effective over quota of 100% means they charge basically the NBBO. Effective over quota of 0 means they're filling everything at mid quote, which essentially would be the best ex ante that I think one could expect. So you want to have you're hoping your broker is going to provide you the lowest possible EFQ. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind as we look at some of the subsequent regressions and graphs. So the brokers allocate some portion of orders to each market makers. They use about 4 or 5 wholesalers. And a couple of these wholesalers are relatively bigger than other. That's not necessarily a new fact. That's not necessarily a new aspect of the industry. It's not surprising that the allocations are somewhat asymmetric. Some of the firms from other public data, the firms are of varying sizes. So then, this picture illustrates, in the case of broker B, for NASDAQ 100 stocks, that's one of the buckets that they use, the reallocations. So just to help you interpret this a bit, so broker B is using 5 market centers or wholesalers. And I think the key points to highlight are, so on the vertical axis is effective over quota. So lower values on the vertical axis mean better execution. If a particular wholesaler is giving you good execution, you see at the lower values, you see a lot of O's. That basically means that those wholesalers are getting rewarded. That's what the O's are. They're getting rewarded. They're getting bumped up typically by about 5%. The X's refer to being punished. Those are declines in share. So what we're illustrating here are the declines that in this bucket when the brokers adjust the weights on the wheel that they're using. The X's reflect the punishment. The O's reflect rewards, and you can see the pattern that when effective over quota is low, so execution is really good, those brokers are getting rewarded, and vice versa. That's really the key message of this graph. So how does, I think, and the key question is, how does last month's effective over quota impact next month's order share? Now, the Schwartz et al. Paper suggests that the brokers don't round based on performance. In our case, with obviously very different type of data, we find a different result. And we do some regressions with this, and the regressions will be of 2 forms. One just focuses upon the absolute EFQ. Keep in mind, lower is better. And the other focuses upon EFQ rank. So that's, in effect, are you first or second, when you move from first to second to third, what's the impact on your share? And just to help you interpret the coefficients, so here's here's regressions that we ran with the data that we had we had available. And let me highlight a couple of the coefficients. So the prior EFQ, for every 1% increase in EFQ, the broker A reduces, and remember the buckets are different, so the meaning of the coefficients isn't directly comparable. But broker A reduces the order flow by 0.8% for every 1% increase in EFQ. And broker B reduces by 1.2%, basically. And the EFQ rank, broker A, if you change if you increase the ordinal ranking, broker, you've got 6% to 10% less allocation. Obviously, a change in rank is a pretty big thing compared to 1% reallocation. So that's why those coefficients are much bigger. So I want to look then at how sensitive are our brokers' routing decisions, and in particular, so in the Schwartz et al. Paper, the brokers don't seem to route much based upon past performance. But I think our data lends itself to exploring these issues a bit further, in part because we have data on the size. In their case, the sizes are all very small, and I think also because we know because we're able to link it to the particular, because we also link it to the particular policies of the firms. So this is some regressions in the case of broker A. They routed based on 30 days of history. So one thing we did here was we explored what would happen if the broker, what kind of statistics emerge if instead of routing based upon 30 days, we're route based upon more or less EFQ. And I think what we found interesting here was that the coefficient was highest, and the R square was highest when everything peaked at 30 days relative to these alternatives. So using the window that the broker uses in practice seems to have the most produces the best performance of these performance-based regressions. So we did the analogous thing for order size. And remember, this was the broker A was the broker where we had 5 size categories. The size categories range from odd lots, i.e. less than 100 shares, to over 5,000 shares. The R square for size 3, which was the actual size of the trades we were exploring, the R square here was by far and away the highest. So it sort of seems that the broker focus is playing a huge role in the reallocations that they do, that the brokers are using these specific windows as they told us they did. So what about market? Let me turn to then the issue of market conditions. Well, there are interesting things we can say about market conditions. In particular, how does the wholesale performance change with market conditions? To what extent is there competitive pressure, and do those competitive pressures change with different environments? To what extent is there cross subsidies in liquidity? So here we're going to focus largely on the volatility of the markets, and this was table based upon the data from broker A. And the basic point is that in volatile markets, the EFQ ratios decrease, and the EFQ decreases on volatile days. So what all this is suggesting is that on volatile days, there's more opportunity to provide price improvement, and that's indeed what the brokers what the brokers do, and it's suggestive of there's more opportunity to provide price improvement and also more competitive pressure to do so. So I've hit now the 11:30 mark. So maybe again this would be a good point to pause for questions.
Hey, Chester, could you just go back to the previous slide, please, which I found informative? Thank you.
Yep, sure. Okay. So is that, you just want me to display that a little bit? Is that, Mark, was that the point?
Yeah, I was perhaps
yeah.
taken by if those are standard errors there, that your T-stats on intraday volatility are extraordinarily high, which sometimes can be disconcerting while it's lovely at the same time. I'm trying to digest how that can be so strongly predictive if somehow we aren't regressing the result on some variant of itself.
Okay. Thank you for that point. We'll try to reflect on that further as well. Other questions?
Yeah, Chester, going back to an earlier point where you mentioned an important feature is the brokers get the same PFOF payment from everybody. Can you give us more color on how they decide what that payment actually is going to be?
Let's be careful with anonymity. Is the one thing.
Well, how they decide where it would be? Well, yeah. So what I would say, so this is not directly a paper about PFOF, so we really didn't try to drill down so directly on that. But what I would observe is that we've learned from other studies that the different firms have different toxicity, and perhaps that provides some scope for both higher payment for order flow, while also helping to get your customers, even if you have a lot of toxicity in your order flow, to also get better price improvement for your customers. But how they, but we've not, but I say that just based upon some of the other studies, but we've not tried to drill down. We've not tried to drill down at all on those relationships, or on how brokers, I really view this as kind of a comparison more about the competition. I view this as a paper not about the competition among the brokers, but about the competition that the brokers create for wholesalers.
Yeah, it's out of the scope of this paper, but it seems to me a fascinating negotiation, because the brokers for antitrust reasons the market makers for antitrust reasons can't really conspire with each other. They're not supposed to. So if I'm the broker and I say, hey, I'm going to charge you $1 a share and I'm going to route you this order, at what point would the brokers turn off that particular customer? And because after all, we're in a business where fractions of a penny matter, so I have a big incentive to set it as high as I can get away with.
Jim, I think for about 4 or 5 different reasons, that's like way beyond the scope of our paper. So let me maybe I can move on to other questions.
Chester, I just wanted to say really quickly, from that figure you showed when the broker punishes or rewards wholesalers for past performance, it seemed, and maybe I haven't looked at it long enough, but it seemed like this particular broker is a little bit late sometimes and punishes once things have improved, and rewards, the other way around. So kind of could be something interesting you guys could look at, is what's the optimal way of structuring these incentives. Maybe 3 months, which I think is what this broker does. Maybe 3 months is too long.
Yeah, well, I think it's an interesting issue with the optimal way to structure the incentives, and I think to some extent, you know, in our conversations with the brokers, they had you know, slightly different. Obviously, they had slightly different perspectives, and you know, to some extent, I'm sure that they know about the practices of their brethren. I'm sure they know about the practices of their brethren. I assume, like in other labor markets, there's some mobility across these types of firms, either among brokers or from wholesalers to brokers and vice versa. But you know, anyway, I think you're raising an interesting question, and one that we've been kind of fascinated by throughout.
I think one broker did share an interesting story of, you know, their consideration of this window is, of course, you know, the shorter the window, the faster you're awarding good performance. But what they told us is they could see sometimes if they went too short of a window, what would happen is if you're a very small wholesaler, you're getting 5% of the flow. It's very cheap for you to manipulate and give very good performance on that 5% of flow to try and win 20% of their flow and then give bad performance. And so I think that's kind of the trade-off there in timing, which is, as you said, a shorter window, it becomes too cheap to manipulate on a small amount of flow to try and get a bigger amount of flow, jack up the price. So you want a longer window, and you know, maybe it's too long, maybe not, but there is a trade-off there.
Thanks, Tom.
One more question on this. Just following up on what Tom just said, it sounded like maybe these brokers are experimenting a little bit with their window length. Do they do this experimentation during the period of time where you have data?
We wish.
Not that I recall. Not that I recall. Tom, do you remember about that?
No. So I think the one broker who did refer to an experiment, that was years before our sample period.
Yeah. So if anything, then I sort of took our sample to be relatively clean in that from more of a kind of empirical perspective. I took our sample to be maybe relatively clean from that perspective. Although that's not not quite the point that you were getting at.
Can I ask also, it's well known to the wholesalers how they evaluate it, like it's 30 days or 90 days, bundle, non-bundle, or is there some uncertainty?
I think they know. I think they're given a lot of feedback. My understanding was they're given a lot of feedback. That part of the mechanism is the broker, and maybe this I wasn't so explicit about. I think the brokers try to hold the feet to the fire of the wholesalers. They say you're doing okay, or maybe more to the point, sometimes they say you could be doing a lot better. I think they do try to send. I do think they do try to send those messages. I do think they try to deliver those messages. That's actually part of the point. You know, and I think they're pretty explicit. My understanding was they were very explicit about how they're doing the measurement.
I think one of the brokers maybe suggested that they would try and say, like, okay, you're first by this much or you're second by this much, but not give full information revelation. So we thought about trying to look for some sort of, you know, revelation effects of like when they disclose where brokers are, do we see the sudden changes in performance? We didn't see much of an effect. And generally, the sense we got from talking with other brokers and wholesalers is that they are very aware, whether it's explicitly disclosed or not, they're very good at figuring out from public data, and whatever is disclosed from other brokers, they're good at figuring out exactly where they are.
You know, and obviously there, you know, we're focused on what we can learn from this data, and obviously also respecting the anonymity that we have to keep. You know, but presumably within the industry, they're also matching it up with various publicly available data sources. You know, including things like the 605 data. Okay, so let me see.
Pankaj has one question.
Yeah, okay.
So I suspect you may not have brokers which have toxic order flow, but the toxicity of the customer order flow still changes within the less toxic brokers, right? So is it not a two-way street where the wholesalers are also deciding like how to reward brokers with price improvement, or how to avoid some of the broker order flow?
Let me see if let me try to address that. So the broker, the deal that the brokers have with the wholesalers is you will take everything we send to you. That's the deal, and you can decide how much price improvement you're going to give on an individual order. But you're gonna take everything, and this is how we allocate. So I don't know. Does that answer your
Maybe
question?
partially, I guess, but so there is no decision making on part of wholesalers, you're saying, right? It's all the brokers only
Well,
deciding.
there could be decision making on the part of wholesalers at the level of the individual order. It can decide how much price improvement to provide on an individual order. That could vary. Where there is no decision making, however, as to whether to execute the order.
Okay.
But you could provide no improvement on a particular order. That's the.
But even like I understand some brokers are totally avoided by wholesalers, like the interactive broker who have more professional retail. But again, you know it better. Thanks.
Well, that may be. You know, I don't know. We have data from 3 brokers. That's the data we're exploring.
Maybe one thing we could say is the previous regression where Mark thinks maybe our standard errors are a little bit too high. We have to think about how we cluster. But what we're trying to show with that regression is when quoted spreads really get wide, you could think that maybe exchange order flows become more toxic. Maybe retail flow doesn't become quite as toxic. In that case, wholesalers are actually able to give a lot more price improvement. And so what we see is quoted spreads go up, effective spreads go up a little bit. And so the overall effective over quoted really improves for retail trades. And that's what we're kind of thinking, like as the nature of the flow changes, what we see is, you know, when market conditions change, how much EFQ wholesalers are willing to give changes.
Yeah, good point. Thanks.
So I'm gonna turn back to my slides if that's okay.
Yes, please. Let's move in the interest of
I
time.
may
Thank
go.
you.
It looks like since I used up almost all the 15 minutes just now in the Q&A, maybe I can go a little bit beyond the.
Yes.
In
So
any
we
case,
have less time at the end for questions, but we're still good.
but I'll also stay. I'm also happy to stay around too, and I won't use I definitely won't use all the hour. You know, so what can we say about how wholesalers compete? And I think I'm gonna let me skip the graph and do you know how do the wholesalers behave depending upon their competition? What's the effect of the distance from the wholesaler to the next best wholesaler, for example, or from the wholesaler to the next worst wholesaler? So we're going to present some simple performance-related regression statistics. So the wholesaler's performance depends upon the competitors. They improve their performance when they fall behind. They reduce their performance when they have a large lead. And interestingly, the results are somewhat stronger in the last 10 days of the month. You know, that's a kind of more of a secondary effect, but I think it's kind of interesting. That that sometimes they're concerned about their positioning before they're going to be before they're going to be evaluated. So then we explore a case. So there was an entry by a large market maker. Working as a wholesaler, and broker A started working with this wholesaler in December of 2021, and so then we explored somewhat. And by the way, I should note that when entry happens, the different brokers might only decide to work with the broker at different points in time. But we thought the entry was sort of an interesting little experiment if we could get data on both sides of the entry. In particular, you know, here I'll highlight that for the upper for the upper coefficient, for a 1% increase in EFQ from first to second, there's sort of additional routing. There's additional in EFQ from the first to the second. there's this change in the share post entry. Now, what I'll point out also is that what really matters is the relevant margin, the first to the second. The first to the average price is not significant, because what's really key is what you're competing, what you're competing with. So, it's an interesting issue, the presence of entry. So it raises a question: was the original system, was it perfectly competitive? Well, obviously, if there's entry, maybe it suggests it wasn't. You can view it in a number of ways, but you could view it as that the prior system wasn't perfectly competitive because there was scope for entry. But I think it's interesting that when you look at the impacts post entry, that some of the statistics are suggesting that there's just a lot of displacement of the share, and that the entrant base to some extent might be actually subsidizing liquidity, which maybe is kind of roughly consistent with the competition story. Okay, so let me turn next to, there was a change in one broker actually followed made a relatively explicit change in their focus. They announced this is BR broker B. They implemented the focus change on January 1st, 2020. They consider all aspects of performance, but before that date, there was a special focus on orders from 100 shares to 2,000 shares. After that date, there was a special focus on orders of size 1 to 2,000, i.e. including odd lots. So the change was whether they also took odd lots into account. And interestingly, the wholesalers immediately responded. And I think this is maybe one of the more striking pieces of evidence in the paper. It's consistent with the wholesalers paying a lot of attention to how they're being judged, and that they're monitoring all this. So here's a graph to illustrate the adjustment in shares. Now, so one question that arises from the graph, and I would say that basically the adjustment was immediate. I think we need to redo this plot, actually, because I think the way we're measuring things is sort of using data that sort of lagged, and so that's why it takes 6 months for the share to fully adjust. But I think that's a measurement issue with the way we do the plot, as opposed to that the market didn't respond right away. And in fact, I think it's kind of striking that it's basically 6 months, and then it kind of the effect levels off. But it's a pretty striking type of response. These are on the odd lots. So the odd lots before, they weren't a special focus, and then they become a special focus, and the EFQ the EFQ for these falls dramatically, as you can see. And then, but interestingly, it doesn't necessarily mean that overall execution has necessarily improved, because here's a plot for the very large orders. And for the very large orders, actually, if anything, that suggests that the execution declined over that period. So it seems like there was some substitution in execution quality, which I think is also kind of a striking finding. So let me turn. Oh, oops. So let me turn. The final set of things I want to just briefly talk about are the order type distribution. As I noted earlier, broker A routes each symbol separately. So, for example, Apple is routed based on its history, and Microsoft is routed based upon its history, and they use a number. This broker A uses 5 different categories. And here I'll just present a couple of graphs. So on the left side are the illiquid symbols, And here across the different wholesalers, you get very similar distributions. Whereas on the right side, you have the liquid symbols. And in particular, venues 3 and 5 seem to provide the most improvement. There seems to be more variation in the active versus the less active stocks across the across the wholesalers. Frankly, I found this kind of surprising, because my own instincts is that the comparative advantage of the large wholesalers would be mostly in the illiquid. But I think this is something where, I think this is something, maybe there's some different views among the authors about. But anyway, it's an interesting result in any case, and kind of consistent with the spirit of this. Similarly, you see a similar pattern for the large orders versus the small orders for the large players. Now here it's less surprising to me. Here I'm not surprised that the largest players, they would have a comparative advantage in dealing with large orders, and for the small orders, presumably the various wholesalers don't have much difference in advantage. And so I think at this point, I probably ought to stop and just open it up to questions.
Hey, Chester, if you go back to slide 36, I think you have a very interesting possibility here, which is B1 acts sort of early in this space, if you will, and then the others react. I think in your notion of competition and dynamics, that may be quite interesting, something to emphasize and think about.
So so Mark, you're saying that the downward trend starts earlier.
That the blue line acts, and then all of a sudden, almost unanimously, the competitors act right after that. So maybe they didn't pay attention, and all of a sudden, now we've introduced competition in that space, and they all react and they move to a new equilibrium.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. Other questions?
Yeah, you had talked about the observed a substitution effect around EQ. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, let me see. The substitution. Let's see.
I think just on those two graphs that we were just on.
Oh yeah,
Chester,
sorry.
Like, what happens with small orders versus big orders?
Yeah. So what's the nature of the substitution? Thanks, Tom. What's the nature? What's the nature of the substitution effect? So here they're improving. They're improving the performance. So here they're improving the performance on the orders which are now part of the special focus, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily improving performance on all the orders. In fact, this plot is, so these are outside, these are more than 2,000 shares. So these are outside the special focus. And if anything, there's degradation in the quality of the execution for those that are not part of the special focus. So that's what I viewed as at least partially a substitution effect. It was kind of a little bit surprising. It kind of relates to a regulatory issue in a broader regulatory issue, not specific one on this, but sometimes regulators think, and maybe more broadly, not just in the security space, sometimes policymakers in Washington think that they can squeeze businesses on some particular margin, and indeed they may be able to, but that potentially has consequences for the overall nature of the competitive equilibrium, or of whatever the equilibrium is, and may be met with responses in other directions. you know, if you think about competitive equilibrium, for example, nature of a free entry condition is enough. You're sort of squeezed with more cost on some dimensions, it will potentially lead to substitution on other dimensions.
Do you guys have any sort of idea of volumes in this category versus volumes in the odd lot category that is being juxtaposed here? Because if the odd lot volumes are very small and these volumes are large, then I guess it's not clear if that decision was optimal.
Tom, do you remember what we have? Whether we have it?
No, I think we don't even have that data.
Yeah,
we just know the EFQ. We don't know the volume. I'd have to double check.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. You're raising an interesting point. You're certainly raising an interesting point. You know, what's the relative? How do we weight? How do we, in effect, how do we weight? Maybe the most simple terms. How do we weight the two pictures?
Another issue within there is, like, you know, the EFQs go above 100, but that's because we're just measuring relative to the MBBO, and these trades are potentially larger than MBBO. So if we were to really do this rigorously, we would measure against like the actual depth weighted MBBO.
Oh, yeah, yeah. That's actually a fundamental problem with the picture of the interpretation.
So in terms of the routing decisions, isn't it a very important policy implication? Like, there is talk of PFOF ban, right, from the SEC. Will that totally change the structure? I mean, will the industry even collapse? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the SEC has not proposed a PFOF ban. The SEC has actually proposed other ways to restructure the markets. In fact, if anything, the chair seemed to take the PFOF ban kind of off the relatively early on, seemed to take the PFOF ban off the table even before the current set of proposals was sort of out there 18 months ago.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Maybe that relates to a nice earlier question by Pankaj, which is that the broker space has become more consolidated over time. And I think a PFOF ban, were it to take place, would be very bad for one broker who makes most of their money from PFOF, and not so bad for some of the other brokers, because some of the other big brokers take zero PFOF. And so that might actually make the broker space less competitive. Would it change the nature of wholesaler broker relationships? I think no, because even if you take the PFOF away, there's all this incentive to compete over EFQ.
Yeah, and one point that I would add on the PFOF issue, one of the things that's most striking to me about broker routing is that you know, as they've announced publicly, Vanguard and Fidelity, they don't take PFOF, but they don't route to the exchanges. So the routing, so their routing's not about trying to beg for PFOF. That's not what their routing is about. Their routing is presumably about the price improvement that they're getting for their customers.
Yeah, I always wonder what's the revenue model. I mean, for them, I think Vanguard, it's pretty clear. Maybe it's the mutual fund fee, but how exactly are they rewarded without the PFOF?
Well, I think. I mean, you know, I think these firms have revenue, you know, have revenue from various sources. So they're presumably they're making some judgment about this. Right. And maybe, by the way, we're not able to study the question of if you take PFOF versus you don't take PFOF. How does that improve the execution experience of your customers? That would be a very interesting question. Right. But that seems like it's more on point to the issue you're raising.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Thank you.
Have a hand raised from John Ritter. John.
Hey, I was just curious. Does your data have information on kind of what percentage of the executed shares were executed on a principal basis versus a riskless principal basis? I was just kind of curious how the trade-off might have affected for the large orders on the along that dimension.
Yeah,
No,
I
we
don't think we have that. Yeah,
Be-
we wouldn't have that. That wouldn't even, yeah, that we would not have raised that, I don't think.
Okay, thanks.
I'm not sure if there are further questions, but we're at the top of the hour. So I just wanted to say thank you for everybody who came. Thank you. Special thanks for Chester and the co-authors for the very interesting presentation. It's always a pleasure to have you. We're going to see you all in 2 weeks, hopefully, where we'll have Jian Wu speaking to us about dynamic market choice. And if there are any questions, further questions, we're still here, but so please go ahead. I don't see any raised hands, but feel free to speak up. No?
Okay.
Well, in that case, we're perfectly on time.
Okay.
So thank you again, Chester, Tom, Andrey, and Jian. Thanks for
Thank you.
coming. Thank you all for questions.
Okay.
See you all in 2 weeks.
Right. Bye-bye. Thank you again, everybody. Appreciated the
Thank you.
questions.